blood, dirt, and cordite. That's what a combat dog smells before deciding if you are friend or prey. When a bitter veteran brought his lethal Malinois into the clinic, he expected the civilian nurses to scatter. He never expected the beast to bow to a tired woman in scrubs. Fluorescent lights buzzed like a dying wasp inside the cracked ceiling grate of the physical therapy wing. D'Angelo Ross hated that sound. It burrowed into his skull, reminding him of the cheap neon signs outside the bars in Virginia Beach, where he used to drink away the adrenaline of deployments. Now there were no deployments. There was only the sterile, bleach-soaked purgatory of the Veterans Affairs Rehabilitation Clinic. D'Angelo shifted his weight on the vinyl examination table. The paper beneath him crinkled loudly, a fragile, useless barrier against the cold surface. He reached down, his thick, scarred fingers tracing the edge of the carbon fiber socket that gripped his right thigh. The amputation was a year old, but his brain hadn't caught up to the reality of the IED in Helmand. His missing calf still itched, his non-existent toes still cramped in the middle of the night. The phantom pain was a liar, but it was a convincing one. At his feet lay Havoc. 80 pounds of Belgian Malinois, corded muscle and teeth resting on the speckled linoleum like a coiled spring. Havoc's eyes, a piercing amber, were fixed on the closed door of the examination room. He wasn't panting. He wasn't relaxed. Combat dogs didn't do relaxed. They existed in a perpetual state of condition yellow, ready to escalate to red the moment their handler gave the word, or the moment they smelled a threat. D'Angelo liked it that way. He needed the barrier. Since returning stateside, D'Angelo had developed a specific, impenetrable armor. It wasn't made of Kevlar. It was made of pure, unadulterated cynicism. He despised the pitying looks from civilians. He hated the soft, cautious voices of the medical staff who treated him like a piece of unexploded ordnance that might go off if they spoke too loudly. They looked at him and saw a broken hero. D'Angelo looked in the mirror and saw a useless liability. To keep the pity at bay, he weaponized his bitterness, and he weaponized Havoc. The clinic staff were terrified of the dog. Last Tuesday, a young, fresh-out-of-college nurse had tried to take D'Angelo's blood pressure. She had approached with a trembling hand, smelling of vanilla lotion and anxiety. Havoc had stood up, the hair on his ridgeline bristling, and issued a low, guttural vibration from deep within his chest. It wasn't even a full growl, just a warning. The nurse had dropped her clipboard and practically sprinted from the room in tears. D'Angelo hadn't apologized. He had just smirked. It was easier this way. If they were scared of the dog, they didn't ask stupid questions about how he was feeling. They got in, did their jobs with shaking hands, and got out. No small talk, no fake sympathy. The doorknob turned. Havoc's ears swiveled forward like radar dishes. His head snapped up, tracking the movement. D'Angelo leaned back against the wall, crossing his thick, tattooed arms over his chest. He pulled his mouth into that familiar, lopsided smirk. He was ready for the next victim, ready for the hesitation, the wide eyes, the nervous stutter. The door pushed open. A woman walked in. She was of average height, wearing faded, standard-issue navy blue scrubs that hung loosely on her frame. A cheap plastic stethoscope was draped around her neck. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy utilitarian knot, secured by a single elastic band. She held a digital tablet in one hand and a blood pressure cuff in the other. Her face was pale, tired, with dark smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes. She looked like 1,000 other overworked nurses in 1,000 other underfunded hospitals. She didn't look up from her tablet immediately. She let the door click shut behind her with a soft thud. Havoc rose. It was a fluid, silent motion. 1 second he was resting. The next, he was standing at attention, inserting himself directly between D'Angelo and the newcomer. The dog lowered his heavy head slightly, the thick muscles of his neck tensing. A low, vibrating growl started in his throat, a sound you felt in your boots before you heard it in the air. D'Angelo's smirk deepened, carving harsh lines into his weathered face. He let the leash remain entirely slack in his hand. He wanted to see how long it would take for this one to break. "Don't go near him," D'Angelo said. His voice was a gravelly baritone, dripping with mock concern. "He doesn't like sudden movements, or people. Actually, he just hates the smell of this place. I'd stay by the door if I were you, sweetheart." He waited for the flinch. He waited for her to clutch the tablet to her chest, for her breath to hitch, for the inevitable stuttering request to please secure the animal, sir. It didn't happen. The woman didn't stop. She didn't gasp. She didn't freeze. She tapped the screen of her tablet, locking it, and slid it smoothly into the deep pocket of her scrub top. Then she lifted her eyes. They were a flat, slate grey. There was no warmth in them, but more importantly to D'Angelo, there was absolutely zero fear. She looked at D'Angelo first. A quick, clinical sweep from his messy hair down to the carbon fibre socket. It wasn't a look of pity. It was an assessment, like a mechanic diagnosing a cracked engine block. Then her grey eyes shifted down to Havoc. The Malinois was still growling, a low, menacing rumble. His amber eyes were locked onto her knees, calculating the distance for a takedown. "Blood pressure, heart rate, and surgical sight check, Mr. Ross," she said. Her voice was steady, quiet, and completely devoid of the artificial customer service cheer most nurses used. "I need your right arm." D'Angelo's smirk faltered slightly, but he forced it back. He didn't move his arm. He just pointed at the 80-pound wall of fur and teeth blocking her path. "Did you not hear me? I said, he bites. You take one more step, and I'm not responsible for what he takes out of your leg." The nurse stopped about 4 feet from Havoc. She didn't back away, but she didn't crowd the dog's space either. She just stood there. That was when D'Angelo noticed her stance. She wasn't standing like a civilian. Most people, when confronted by an aggressive dog, either lean backward in retreat or lean forward in a misguided attempt to dominate. This woman was perfectly balanced. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, her weight distributed evenly on the balls of her feet. Her shoulders were squared, completely relaxed but ready to pivot. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, palms slightly open, nowhere near her pockets or her face. It was a combat stance, stripped of aggression but radiating readiness. Havoc stopped growling. The sudden silence in the small examination room was deafening. D'Angelo frowned, gripping the leash a little tighter. "Havoc! Wach!" he commanded, using the German word for watch. Havoc didn't look back at D'Angelo. The dog's ears twitched. His nose flared, taking in deep, rapid drafts of air. He was scenting her. Dogs, especially highly trained military working dogs, don't just see the world. They smell emotions. They smell the sharp, metallic tang of cortisol and adrenaline when someone is terrified. They smell the sour stench of deception. D'Angelo knew what Havoc usually smelled on these nurses: panic. But Havoc's posture was changing. The bristling hair along his spine lay flat. The tension in his back legs eased. He took a half step forward, extending his snout towards the woman's scrubs. D'Angelo felt a prickle of genuine confusion. "Havoc 9!" he snapped. The dog ignored him. This was unprecedented. Havoc had been trained in the dust of Kandahar. He did not break commands. He certainly did not break commands for a random, VA nurse in faded blue scrubs. The woman looked down at the dog. She didn't offer her hand to be sniffed, a rookie mistake that usually ended with lost fingers. She didn't speak to him in a high-pitched baby talk voice. She simply held her ground, projecting a profound, terrifyingly calm energy. Then she shifted her weight, a microscopic adjustment of her hips, and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture meant for a human, it was a release of pressure, a silent physical communication of dominance and acceptance. Havoc exhaled, a long huff of air through his nose. He took one more step forward, closing the distance between them. "Hey," D'Angelo warned, sitting up straight, his hand tightening on the leash to pull the dog back. Before D'Angelo could apply tension, Havoc turned his body parallel to the nurse. With a heavy sigh, the lethal combat dog lowered his hindquarters to the floor. He sat. Not just a casual sit, but a formal, rigid heel position, his right shoulder pressing firmly against the nurse's left shin. He leaned his heavy head back against her knee, looking up at her with soft, compliant eyes. It was the ultimate gesture of submission and trust from a working dog. He was claiming her as an equal. D'Angelo felt the breath leave his lungs as if he'd been punched in the sternum. The smirk completely vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed stare. He looked from his dog, his fiercely protective, borderline feral dog, to the tired woman in scrubs. "What?" D'Angelo's voice cracked. He swallowed hard. "What the hell did you just do?" The nurse didn't smile. She reached down, her movements slow and deliberate, and rested her hand gently on top of Havoc's head. The dog leaned into her touch, his eyes closing in contentment. "He smells the gunpowder," she said quietly. D'Angelo froze. "What?" "Gunpowder, CLP solvent, old blood, cortisol." She looked up, her grey eyes locking onto D'Angelo's. The exhaustion in her face seemed to peel away, revealing something hard and uncompromising underneath. "He's looking for a handler. He's looking for someone whose heart rate isn't spiking at 120 beats a minute because they're terrified of a dog." She took a step forward, and Havoc immediately rose and moved with her, flawlessly mirroring her pace until she reached the examination table. "My heart rate is resting at 55, Mr. Ross," she continued, her voice remaining perfectly level. "I don't sweat adrenaline. I don't smell like prey. Your dog knows the difference between a civilian and an operator. It's a shame you don't." D'Angelo's hands went numb. He stared at her, really looking at her this time. He saw the scars now, a thin, jagged white line tracing the edge of her jawline. The way she held her left arm slightly tighter to her body, a subconscious protection of an old rotator cuff injury. He noticed her hands as she reached for the blood pressure cuff. No rings, fingernails clipped to the quick, and knuckles thickened by years of impact calluses. "Who are you?" D'Angelo demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "My name is Sapphira," she said, unwrapping the blood pressure cuff. "I'm your nurse." "Bullshit," D'Angelo spat, though there was no heat behind it. He was reeling. "Nurses don't walk like that. Nurses don't break a Malinois command structure with a shift in body weight. And nurses don't know what CLP smells like." Sapphira paused. She held the nylon cuff in her hands, her thumbs brushing over the Velcro. For a fraction of a second, the clinical mask slipped. A ghost of a memory, dark and violent, flickered in her grey eyes. "Some do," she said softly. She stepped directly into D'Angelo's personal space, entirely ignoring the massive dog leaning against her leg. She grabbed D'Angelo's right wrist. Her grip wasn't the gentle, fluttering touch of a civilian caregiver. It was a firm, locking grasp. She found his radial pulse instantly, pressing her fingers into the groove of his wrist with the exact pressure of a combat medic checking vitals under fire. "Now," Sapphira said, raising her eyes to meet his again. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with unspoken histories. "Are you going to let me do my job, Ross? Or are you going to keep hiding behind the dog?" D'Angelo looked down at Havoc. The dog opened one eye, looked at D'Angelo, and then closed it again, resting his chin comfortably on Sapphira's shoe. The betrayal was complete. D'Angelo slowly unclenched his jaw. He looked back up at Sapphira. The bitterness that had fueled him for the past 12 months suddenly felt useless, like trying to shoot a tank with a BB gun. He realized, with a sinking, terrifying clarity, that the woman standing in front of him wasn't someone he could intimidate. She was someone who understood. "Left arm is better," D'Angelo muttered, breaking eye contact and shifting his body to offer his left bicep. "Veins are shot on the right." Sapphira nodded once, a crisp, efficient motion. "Left arm it is." The hiss of the Velcro sounded abnormally loud in the confined space of examination room 4. Sapphira wrapped the cuff around D'Angelo's left bicep. Her fingers brushed his skin, cool, dry, and entirely steady. She didn't fumble with the gauge. She didn't ask if the pressure was too tight. She simply squeezed the rubber bulb, her grey eyes fixed on the dial. The nylon gripped D'Angelo's arm, compressing the muscle. He stared at the side of her face. The jagged white scar on her jawline disappeared into the collar of her scrub top. It looked like shrapnel, a high-velocity fragment that had ripped through the epidermis and barely missed the carotid artery. 148/92, Sapphira stated, turning the valve. The air hissed out in a long, defeated sigh. "White coat syndrome," D'Angelo said, his voice flat. Sapphira unhooked the cuff and began folding it with tight, economic movements. "You aren't afraid of doctors, Ross. You're just angry at the geometry of this room. It's a fatal funnel. One door, no windows, cinder block walls. You've been sitting there calculating penetration angles since I walked in, which is spiking your cortisol." She dropped the cuff into a plastic bin on the counter. "And you're tired. When was the last time you logged more than 4 continuous hours of sleep?" D'Angelo bristled. "I sleep fine." "Your resting heart rate says you're running a marathon in your head every night," she countered, finally turning to look directly at him. "Night terrors. The phantom pain acts up when the ambient temperature drops around 2 in the morning. Am I close?" D'Angelo didn't answer. He couldn't. It was exactly what happened. At his feet, Havoc let out a long, contented breath, completely relaxed against Sapphira's shin. The betrayal stung, but it was eclipsed by a sudden, intense curiosity. "Who did you run with?" D'Angelo asked. He dropped the sneer. The cynicism felt heavy, useless against someone who spoke the language. Sapphira picked up her digital tablet. She tapped the screen, bringing up his chart. "I'm a nurse at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. I run with underfunded physical therapists and overworked orderlies." "Don't give me that," D'Angelo snapped, shifting his weight forward. The carbon fiber socket ground against his residual limb, sending a sharp, electric spike of pain up his spine. He winced, sucking in a harsh breath through his teeth. Sapphira's eyes snapped to his right leg. She set the tablet down on the stainless steel counter. It hit with a sharp clack. "Unlock the pin," she ordered. "I'm fine. Just bumped the—" "Unlock the pin, Ross, or I will do it for you, and I won't be gentle." There was a cold, absolute authority in her voice. It was the voice of a team leader calling an audible in a hot zone. "You didn't argue with that tone. You obeyed it." D'Angelo's hands moved on instinct. He reached down and depressed the metal release valve on the side of his socket. With a heavy, wet suction sound, The carbon fiber shell detached from the silicone liner encasing his stump. He lifted the heavy prosthetic away, leaning it against the examination table. The smell of trapped sweat and medical-grade silicone filled the air between them. Most nurses crinkled their noses, some held their breath. Sapphira didn't even blink. She knelt on the speckled linoleum. Havoc merely shifted out of her way, circling once before lying flat on his side, exposing his belly. A posture the combat dog hadn't assumed since he was a 6-month-old pup. "Roll up the liner," she said. D'Angelo gripped the thick grey silicone and rolled it down, peeling it off his thigh. The residual limb was a mess of puckered, purplish scar tissue. The skin was angry and inflamed, particularly along the posterior distal end, where the bone had been sawed flat. A deep red friction sore was developing along the outer edge. Sapphira examined the limb. She didn't hover. She placed both her hands directly on his thigh. Her grip was firm, grounding. "You're listing to port," she muttered, her thumbs tracing the inflamed edge of the skin. "You're overcompensating for a heavy step on your left side. It's pitching your center of gravity off by about 3 degrees. That's causing the lateral strut of your socket to dig into the muscle fascia here." She pressed exactly on the red sore. D'Angelo let out a sharp, involuntary hiss. "Sorry." She didn't sound sorry. She sounded analytical. The previous PT missed it because they were too scared to touch you, and you were too busy trying to terrify them to tell them it hurt. She was right. Dead right. The previous physical therapist had barely looked at the leg, opting instead to ask D'Angelo generic questions from across the room while Havoc snarled at the door. "Coronado," Sapphira said quietly, her thumbs still massaging the tight, knotted muscles above the amputation site to increase blood flow. D'Angelo looked down at her. "What? You asked where I was. Bud/S Class 324. Then I got tapped for a specialized integration program. Spent 4 years at Dam Neck. 2 deployments to the Sandbox, 1 to the Horn of Africa." She kept her eyes focused on his leg. "Caught her through and through off a PKM machine gun in Mogadishu. Shattered my shoulder. Tore the rotator cuff to ribbons. Medical discharge." D'Angelo stared at the top of her messy, dark hair. Dam Neck. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. DevGru. SEAL Team 6. "I didn't know they pushed any females through to Tier 1, D'Angelo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They didn't publicize it," Sapphira replied dryly. "Turns out the brass gets nervous when their experimental assets get shot to pieces on an unacknowledged op." She stood up, wiping her hands on her scrub pants. The shared revelation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The walls of the clinic seemed to recede, replaced by the invisible, shared geography of gunships, midnight inserts, and the metallic taste of adrenaline. Suddenly, D'Angelo's right leg cramped. Not the muscle he had left, but the calf muscle that was currently rotting in a biohazard incinerator somewhere in Afghanistan. The phantom cramp was violent. It felt like a pair of red-hot vice grips clamping down on his non-existent Achilles tendon. D'Angelo gasped, his jaw locking tight. His hands gripped the edge of the vinyl examination table, his knuckles turning white. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to breathe through the agonizing, impossible pain. "Breathe, Ross," Sapphira's voice was right at his ear. "It's cramping," he managed to choke out. Sapphira didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it was all in his head. She reached into the cargo pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a heavy, steel trauma shear. She gripped the metal handle and pressed the blunt, cold edge of the heavy steel directly into the back of his existing thigh, digging it brutally hard into the sciatic nerve pathway. The intense, localized physical pressure overloaded the pain receptors traveling up to his brain. It was a neurological override. The searing agony in his phantom calf began to dial back, replaced by the dull, grounding ache of the cold steel pressing into real, living flesh. D'Angelo let out a long, shuddering breath, his forehead resting on his chest. Sweat beaded at his temples. "Better?" she asked, easing the pressure slightly. D'Angelo nodded slowly. "Yeah, Jesus, yeah. My platoon chief lost his arm in Fallujah," Sapphira said quietly, slipping the shears back into her pocket. "Used to get those spikes. The brain is an idiot. It keeps searching for a signal that isn't there, so it makes one up. You have to give it a real signal to process. Deep ischemic pressure works. Next time it hits, take your thumb and dig it into the femoral artery pathway until it hurts. Give your brain something real to fight." D'Angelo looked at her. Her face was calm, tired, and deeply familiar. He realized, with a profound sense of relief, that he didn't need the armor anymore. Not in this room. Sapphira turned away and walked over to his discarded prosthetic leg. She picked it up, inspecting the interior of the carbon fiber socket. She ran her fingers along the inside wall, feeling for the imperfection she already knew was there. "You've got a burr in the resin here," she muttered. "And the strut alignment is biased too far forward. It's forcing you to walk like you're carrying a ruck up a scree slope." She walked over to a metal cabinet in the corner of the room, unlocked it, and pulled out a small, standard-issue toolbox. She returned to the examination table, popped the latch, and withdrew a thick Allen wrench. "I thought nurses just took blood pressure and told me to eat less sodium," D'Angelo said. The edge was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a quiet, genuine respect. "I do that too," Sapphira said, fitting the hexagonal key into the main strut bolt at the base of the socket. With a sharp grunt of effort, she broke the factory seal on the bolt and twisted it half a turn counterclockwise. "But I also fix broken gear, and right now your gear is jacked up." She adjusted 3 more bolts, shifting the pitch of the artificial ankle by a fraction of an inch. It didn't look like much, but D'Angelo knew from his time modifying weapon optics that a fraction of an inch at the base translated to a massive shift at the impact point. "Try it now," Sapphira said, tossing the heavy leg back onto his lap. D'Angelo rolled the silicone liner back over his scarred skin. He aligned the metal pin at the bottom of the liner with the locking mechanism in the socket. He pushed down. Click. The lock engaged. D'Angelo slid off the examination table. He put his weight on the right leg. He braced himself for the familiar, grinding bite against his lateral fascia. It didn't come. The weight distributed evenly across the surface area of the socket. The pitch of the foot held his center of gravity dead neutral. He took a step forward, then another. The gait felt smooth, natural. For the first time in 12 months, he didn't feel like he was fighting his own equipment. He stopped and looked at Sapphira. She was already packing away the Allen wrench, her back to him. "How?" D'Angelo asked. Sapphira closed the toolbox and turned around. She looked exhausted again. The adrenaline of the assessment had faded, leaving behind the crushing weight of a 12-hour shift in a severely understaffed hospital. "Because I know what it feels like to carry broken things," she said simply. "And I know that sometimes you just need someone to turn the wrench." She picked up her tablet and tucked it under her arm. "I've logged your vitals. I'm noting the socket adjustment in your file, though the physical therapist will probably throw a fit about me touching it. Let them. If they try to change it back, tell them I'll slash their tires." D'Angelo actually smiled. It was a small, tight expression, completely foreign to his face. But it was real. "Copy that." Sapphira walked toward the door. As she passed Havoc, she paused. She didn't look down. She just let her hand drop to her side. The Malinois rose silently from the floor. He stepped forward and pressed his wet nose firmly into the center of her calloused palm. It was a quiet, profound gesture of respect. Sapphira gave his ears a brief, firm scratch, then stepped out into the bright, buzzing hallway. The door clicked shut behind her. D'Angelo stood in the center of the examination room. The fluorescent lights still buzzed. The room still smelled of bleach and old linoleum. But the suffocating weight in his chest, the crushing, cynical armor he had worn for a year, felt significantly lighter. He looked down at Havoc. The massive dog was sitting by the door, staring at the closed panel. His ears were relaxed. His amber eyes were calm. "Yeah," D'Angelo said quietly to the empty room. "Me too, buddy." D'Angelo turned and walked toward the door, his gait steady, his stride even. He wasn't fixed. The phantom pain would return. The nightmares would still wait for him in the dark. But as he reached for the doorknob, he realized he wasn't entirely alone in the dark anymore. Sometimes the perimeter didn't need to be guarded. Sometimes it just needed to be shared. If you felt the raw reality of this story, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button and share this video to honor the silent battles our veterans fight every single day. Subscribe to the channel for more gritty, grounded storytelling that doesn't pull punches. Drop a comment below. Have you ever experienced a moment that completely shattered your assumptions about someone? Let's talk about it. Support the channel, share the truth, and stay tuned for the next chapter.